On October 8, 1871, one of the most famous disasters in American history destroyed the city of Chicago. But that same night, another fire was burning just 400 miles away. That fire killed 5 to 8 times more people. It became the deadliest wildfire in American history. Yet somehow, almost no one remembers it. Many were never identified. The grave sits quietly in a town that most people outside northeastern Wisconsin have never heard of, and the event that filled it, one of the most catastrophic fire events in North American history, is known, if at all, as a footnote to something that happened the same night, 400 miles to the south, in a city whose name everyone recognizes. The date was October 8, 1871. That evening, fire broke out in Chicago. It would burn for 2 days, destroy thousands of buildings, displace over 100,000 people, and kill roughly 300. Those numbers are not small. The Great Chicago Fire was a genuine catastrophe, and the city's response to it, the speed of its reconstruction, the ambition of its rebuilding, became one of the defining stories of American industrial will. It was covered by newspapers across the country and around the world. It entered the cultural imagination almost immediately, complete with mythology, iconography, and a cast of familiar characters. On that same night, the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, was consumed by fire in a way that bore almost no resemblance to what was happening in Chicago. This was not a city fire, not a matter of buildings spreading flame to buildings, of crowded blocks and wooden storefronts catching in sequence. What descended on Peshtigo was something closer to atmospheric in its scale. The fire didn't move like a normal wildfire. It raced through the forests faster than people could run. Survivors later said something even more terrifying. The air itself seemed to ignite before the flames even arrived. It generated its own wind. In some accounts, the air itself seemed to combust before the flames arrived. People who ran toward the Peshtigo River, who submerged themselves and stayed there for hours, survived. Many who did not reach the water did not survive. The death toll has never been precisely established. Estimates range from 1,500 to 2,500 people, and some historians suggest the true number may be higher still. The uncertainty is itself part of the story. Whole communities in the surrounding townships were so thoroughly destroyed that there was no one left to report who had been there. The logging camps, the farmsteads scattered through the cut-over land, the small settlements that had grown up along the river, they left almost no documentary residue. There were no census updates, there were no insurance claims. There was not enough infrastructure remaining to generate the paperwork that history later relies upon. Peshtigo in 1871 was a company town in the most literal sense. The businessman William Ogden had invested heavily in a woodenware factory there, the largest in the country at the time, and the town had grown around it. The forests of northeastern Wisconsin were being cleared at an industrial pace, feeding the appetite of expanding Midwestern cities for lumber and fuel. The land was dry that autumn. The summer had been unusually arid across the upper Midwest, and the logging operations had left behind vast stretches of slash, the cut branches, bark strips, and debris that accumulate after timber harvest. This material had been drying for months. The conditions were not merely unfortunate, they were, in retrospect, a near-perfect set of preconditions for catastrophic fire. What is less understood is why those preconditions were not more widely recognized at the time, and why the fires that had already been burning in the area for weeks, small, manageable blazes that settlers had grown accustomed to, did not trigger a more urgent response.
There were warnings in the loose sense. Local residents had been watching smoke on the horizon for days, but the town had been through small fires before, and the idea that something fundamentally different was approaching did not take hold before it was too late to matter. One of the few extended first-hand accounts of the Peshtigo Fire was written by a Catholic priest named Father Peter Pernin, who survived by submerging himself in the river along with a crowd of townspeople and their livestock. His account, published several years after the event, describes the sound of the fire before it arrived, a roar that he compared to the noise of 1,000 trains, and the strange luminous quality of the air as the fire generated its own weather system. Pernin's account is detailed and considered, and it is one of the primary sources historians have worked with. That a single priest's memoir stands as a foundational document for an event of this magnitude says something about how little else was captured. The governor of Wisconsin at the time, Lucius Fairchild, was in Chicago on the night of October 8th, involved in relief coordination for the fire there. When word finally reached him about Peshtigo, the delay in response was measurable. The communication infrastructure that might have transmitted news of the disaster quickly, the telegraph lines, the railroad connections, had largely been destroyed in the fire itself. Chicago had its newspapers and its correspondents already on the ground. Peshtigo had to wait for someone to physically leave and carry the information out.
By the time national media began to cover the Wisconsin fire, the Chicago story had already taken shape. Editors had copy, they had dispatches, they had the narrative momentum of a major urban disaster in a city that American readers knew and cared about. The Peshtigo Fire appeared in newspapers, but it appeared compressed, displaced to inside pages, often described in terms that borrowed their frame of reference from Chicago. It was, in the coverage of the moment, the other fire, the fire that happened at the same time. This is not a story about deliberate suppression or institutional neglect in any conspiratorial sense. It is something quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling, the way that visibility and legibility are distributed unevenly across geography, and how that distribution shapes what gets remembered. Chicago was a city with newspapers. It had correspondence. It had political weight. It had financial interests that extended eastward to New York and across the Atlantic to London. When Chicago burned, the infrastructure for documenting that burning was already in place. Peshtigo was a logging town in a state that had been part of the Union for only 23 years. Its residents were largely recent immigrants, German, Irish, Scandinavian, many of whom kept records, if at all, in languages other than English. When it burned, the mechanisms for translating that burning into national narrative were either absent or overwhelmed. The question of memory is not simply about attention. It is about what gets filed, transcribed, preserved, and integrated into the accounts that later generations inherit. Chicago produced grief, but it also produced archives. Peshtigo produced grief largely in silence. The mass grave in Marinette County was consecrated and then, for decades, left outside the main current of American historical consciousness. Local historians in Wisconsin maintained the record. A small museum was eventually established, but the fire never entered the American imagination the way that Chicago did, never became the subject of novels, of films, of the kind of cultural elaboration that transforms a historical event into a shared reference point. There is something worth sitting with in that asymmetry. The Peshtigo Fire killed more people than Chicago. It burned a larger area than Chicago. By most measures of human cost, it was the larger disaster. And yet the mechanisms of memory, the newspapers, the telegraphs, the political connections, the density of documentation pointed elsewhere.
History, in this sense, is not simply a record of what happened. It is a record of what was legible at the moment it happened, filtered through the infrastructure that existed to capture it. That infrastructure was not neutral. It reflected existing hierarchies of importance, urban over rural, economically central over peripheral, well-connected over isolated. Those hierarchies were not the result of conscious decisions about what to remember and what to forget. They were structural. They were baked into the geography of telegraph lines and railroad routes and newspaper circulation networks. Peshtigo did not fall through the cracks because anyone chose to ignore it. It fell through the cracks because the cracks were very wide in northeastern Wisconsin in 1871. And because the fire destroyed even the local capacity for documentation that might have partially compensated for that absence. What the Peshtigo Fire reveals, if we look at it steadily, is that the historical record has always been a product of infrastructure as much as of events themselves. The things we know in detail about the past are, in part, the things that happened in places where detailed knowing was possible. And the gaps, the absences, the compressed paragraphs, the events that appear only as footnotes are not always the places where less happened. Sometimes they are the places where the infrastructure for recording simply was not there. The mass grave in Marinette County has been maintained. There is a marker now. The Peshtigo Fire Museum holds what documents survived: Father Pernan's account, some photographs taken after the fact, a collection of artifacts from the excavated site. The town still exists, rebuilt, smaller than it once was. Every year on October 8th, there is a ceremony of remembrance that draws a modest gathering. It is a quiet observance for a quiet piece of history. The kind of history that does not demand recognition so much as it rewards those who slow down enough to find it, to notice in the gap between what burned and what was remembered the shape of something larger.